This presentation looks at what we call the three-term contingency. First of all, let's talk about behavior. What is behavior? Behavior is anything an organism does that can be counted. Behavior is measurable, observable, and it's specific, meaning that you can see it and you can hear it, you can count it, and you can clearly define it. Some examples of behavior include waving, talking, looking, smiling, hitting, kicking, and playing the drums. There's about 1 million others. There's another important piece when we think about behavior, and that's that it passes the dead man's test. If a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. And if a dead man can't do it, then it's behavior. So let's say that you came up with a target behavior, does not swear at peers. Does this pass the dead man's test? No. A dead man could refrain from swearing at peers. What would be better? How about speaks to peers without swearing? This passes the dead man test because a dead man does not have the ability to speak. There's also some basic assumptions about ABA that we need to know before we start. Behavior is learned and serves a specific purpose. That purpose is either to get or to get out of. And behavior is related to the context within which it occurs. Those are some basic assumptions that we always need to keep in mind when thinking about our students' behavior. Here's a diagram about the three-term contingency. For every behavior, there are 4 parts: a setting event, which is an environmental event that momentarily changes the effectiveness of reinforcing activities. There's an antecedent, what happened immediately before the behavior. There's the behavior, what the person does that can be counted or measured. And then there's a consequence, what happened immediately after the behavior. It does not necessarily mean something negative or a punishment. A consequence is purely what happened immediately after the behavior. Let's do some active student responding. An environmental event which momentarily alters the effectiveness of reinforcing activities is called A, antecedent, B, consequence, or C, setting event. If you answered C, you're correct. An environmental event that momentarily changes or alters the effectiveness of reinforcing activities is called a setting event. The A in our three-term contingency is the antecedent. Remember, that's what happens immediately before the behavior. Examples of antecedents could be a direction, an instruction, or a prompt delivered to a student. It could be the presence of a person, an item, or an activity. It could be a change in the environment or setting, maybe a loud noise or a transition, or it could just be the structure of the environment. All of those things occur immediately prior to behavior, and so we're going to consider them antecedents. Some more examples of antecedents could include where, school, home, outings, maybe shopping or dining, when, play, transitions, work, bedtime, dinner, leisure, during a movie, or what, a math worksheet, loud music playing, sharing popcorn. Any of these things could occur immediately before behavior, so we consider them antecedents. The B in the three-term contingency is the behavior. Remember that behavior is observable and measurable. What does it look like? Behavior could be hitting, it could be requesting, it could be writing, it could be sweeping, it could be saying hello, it could be nodding, it could be playing guitar. Behavior is anything that we engage in or do that can be measured or counted. And the final piece of the three-term contingency is the C, the consequence. A consequence is an environmental event. It's not necessarily punitive. A consequence occurs immediately after the behavior, and it may or may not be an outcome of behavior. Some consequences that change behavior are reinforcement, which causes the behavior to increase, extinction, which means withholding a reinforcer for a previously reinforced behavior, or punishment, which causes the behavior to decrease. Some examples of consequences, things that happen right after the behavior, might be other students laughing, a high five from a friend, a frown from your boss, you tasted popcorn, your roommate yelled, you heard music, a crowd cheered. Some of these things are things we might consider good or bad, but regardless, the consequence is purely just what happens after the behavior. Some more active student responding. The only way to eliminate a behavior is A, punishment, B, extinction, C, begging them to stop, or D, you cannot eliminate a behavior. If you said extinction, you're correct. Remember that extinction is withholding stimulus or a consequence from a previously reinforced behavior. Let's look at some examples and identify the ABCs. Jane is watching television. Her brother came into the living room and turned the channel. Jane began to cry. Their mother came back in the room and turned the channel back to what Jane was watching. Let's look first at the behavior. When we look at the scenario, what behavior might we be looking at? Jane crying. So when we think about the antecedent, what happens right before Jane begins to cry? Her brother turns the channel. We think about our antecedent, what happens first? The channel was turned. The behavior, crying, what happens immediately after the crying begins? Mom comes back in and turns the channel back. Let's check out another example. Lauren's walking in the park and it starts raining. She opens her umbrella and holds it over her head. She remains dry. Let's think about what the behavior is. Now think about the antecedent, what happens before the behavior, and think about the consequence, what happens immediately after. In this example, Lauren opening the umbrella would be the behavior. What happens right before she opens the umbrella? It begins raining. That's your antecedent. And what happens immediately after she opens the umbrella? She remains dry. That's your consequence. Let's check out a third example. Harold walks into his office building. He sees Kathy coming toward the building. He holds the door open for her. She says, "Thanks," and walks through the door. They walk toward the elevator together. Let's think about your behavior. Now, what happens right before the behavior? And what happens after? Hopefully this matches up with what you were thinking. The three-term contingency is made up of these three terms. A, attitude, behavior, reinforcement. B, antecedent, reinforcement, punishment. C, antecedent, behavior, consequence. Or D, antecedent, stimulus, contrived. The three-term contingency is made up of these three terms: antecedent, behavior, consequence. That's why we call it the ABCs. Some things to remember when thinking about the three-term contingency. Try to think about it as you observe everything around you. The three-term contingency exists for every single behavior that anyone engages in. There's always something that comes before, and there's always a consequence. Ask your new coworkers what consequences are in place for various behaviors. If you see a student raising his or her hand, what consequence might be in place for that? If you see a student crying on the floor, what consequence might be in place for that? You'll need to supplement this presentation with lots of in situ practice. Try looking around both at work and at home to see where you can define these three-term contingencies. The more you think about it and talk about it, the more familiar it will become to you.